Police captain confronts black woman with force, only to discover she holds a higher rank. Captain Derek Sullivan marched through the federal courthouse parking lot, issuing commands to 3 junior officers, brushing past courthouse security, and seizing the black woman by her arm before forcefully pressing her against his patrol car. "You're under arrest for interfering with police business," the seasoned officer declared, his knee pressing firmly into her back. Yet, she remained composed, asserting, "Captain, I am Federal Judge Rebecca Washington, and you need to step back immediately." The officer chuckled dismissively until she recited his badge number, his supervisor's name, and the precise federal statute he was breaching, details that only someone wielding immense judicial power could possibly know. Captain Sullivan remained blissfully unaware that his misguided assault on an innocent soul in an ill-fated location would unleash a cascade of unforeseen repercussions. He believed he was merely confronting another ordinary citizen who required a lesson in humility. He was mistaken. In the ensuing 72 hours, everything he believed about power, authority, and the cost of a single moment of racist arrogance would be irrevocably transformed. This tale unfolds around a single choice that unraveled it all, leading to unforgettable consequences that will linger in your mind. The clock struck 8:47 in the evening. On a Tuesday evening, 2 vastly different realms converged in the most disastrous manner imaginable outside the Richard B. Russell Federal Building in Atlanta, Georgia. Federal Judge Rebecca Washington had just wrapped up a demanding 14-hour day overseeing a multifaceted federal racketeering case. By the age of 45, she had established herself as a highly esteemed jurist in the Southern District of Georgia, recognized for her keen intellect, steadfast integrity, and composed presence in the face of adversity. As dusk settled, she strode through the courthouse's secure parking garage, her leather briefcase in hand, a vessel for sensitive federal case files, heading toward her gleaming silver Mercedes. 3 blocks away, Police Captain Derek Sullivan found himself enduring the most challenging month of his 2-decade-long career. The strain from the mayor's office had grown more acute due to budget cuts, resulting in a 15% decline in clearance rates. Additionally, Internal Affairs had logged 3 complaints regarding the aggressive tactics employed by his office in just the past fortnight. At 52, Sullivan took great pride in his identity as an old-school cop, a steadfast believer in asserting authority before delving into inquiries. This evening, he found himself at the helm of a standard drug sweep operation, one that had produced nothing more than a mountain of paperwork and a cadre of exasperated officers. The call arrived precisely at 8:45 p.m. Unusual activity has been observed in the vicinity of the federal courthouse. A number of individuals were observed lingering in the parking area. Sullivan's jaw clenched at the mention of the address. Government property brought with it a web of oversight, a mountain of paperwork, and a host of complications. Yet a call was a call, and Sullivan remained steadfast in asserting his authority, no matter the jurisdiction. As Judge Washington approached her car, she became aware of the peculiar happenings around her. A trio of police cruisers encircled a gathering of young men close to the visitor parking area. She halted, taking in the tableau with the discerning gaze of one who had devoted years to the intricacies of the criminal justice system. A disquieting sensation lingered in the air, as the officers' positioning and their confrontational demeanor cast an unsettling shadow over the courthouse staff departing after their evening shifts. Sullivan pulled up to the scene in his department-issued Ford Explorer. Emergency lights slicing through the thick, sultry air of an Atlanta night. He examined the circumstances with mounting annoyance. His officers had apprehended 4 individuals, yet it was evident that progress was stalling rapidly. The seemingly dubious figures revealed themselves to be federal court clerks diligently toiling away on case preparations into the late hours. "This is a waste of time," Sullivan murmured to Officer Mike Torres, his latest addition to the team. "But we are here now, and we will ensure that everyone comprehends who holds the reins." Judge Washington noted Sullivan's entrance and instantly sensed the perilous change in atmosphere. Throughout her tenure on the bench, she had encountered this particular breed of law enforcement officer, the one whose inflated ego eclipsed their sound judgment, whose compulsion to assert authority frequently resulted in breaches of constitutional rights. As Sullivan neared the apprehended court employees, Judge Washington rendered a choice that would irrevocably alter the course of their lives. With a decisive click, she secured her car and approached the unfolding scene, her federal judicial authority driving her to guarantee that all protocols were meticulously observed on federal grounds. "Excuse me, officers," she articulated with a commanding clarity, her courtroom voice resonating through the space, "I'm seeking to comprehend the nature of this detention." Sullivan pivoted sharply, his expression betraying a simmering irritation. In the muted glow of the parking lot, he observed a poised black woman in her 40s, elegantly attired and clutching a briefcase, as she challenged his authority. Each bias, each annoyance, every fragment of his bruised pride coalesced into unadulterated fury. Yet, unbeknownst to Captain Sullivan, the woman challenging his authority possessed the means to activate federal protocols that could unravel the very fabric of the empire he had meticulously constructed over the past 2 decades. Every moment that unfolded thereafter was captured by the unblinking eyes of the courthouse security systems, which remained ever vigilant. To grasp the unfolding events, it is essential to delve into the identities of these two individuals and the reasons that made this particular clash unavoidable. Judge Rebecca Washington had not always donned the distinguished robes of the judiciary. 2 decades prior, she had served as a civil rights attorney in Birmingham, Alabama, focusing her expertise on cases of police misconduct. She had crafted her career with precision, triumphing in case after case against departments that believed they were beyond reproach. 5 years ago, her appointment to the federal bench received unanimous confirmation, a remarkable feat in the current political landscape. What rendered Judge Washington especially perilous to an individual such as Captain Sullivan was her vast and comprehensive understanding of federal civil rights law. She had committed to memory each statute, every precedent, and all procedural requirements that dictated the nature of police interactions with the public. Of greater significance, she grasped the federal mechanisms that could be activated when law enforcement officials transgressed constitutional rights on federal property. Captain Derek Sullivan embodied all that Judge Washington had dedicated her career to opposing. Had she been granted access to his personnel file, it would have unveiled a troubling pattern that internal affairs had inexplicably missed for 20 long years. Complaints of excessive force that were inexplicably retracted. Testimonies from witnesses that unexpectedly lost their credibility. Proof that vanished without a trace. Compensations disbursed by the city that remained unreported in the press. Sullivan had not only survived but flourished within the department, for he possessed a keen insight into the inner workings of the system. He understood the art of nurturing relationships with the right supervisors, aligning himself with influential politicians, and winning the favor of key community leaders. For 2 decades, he had woven a web of security that enabled him to act without fear of consequence, yet this evening, that very shield was poised to confront its adversary. "Ma'am, this is police business," Sullivan stated, his voice resonating with the authority of one who expects instant obedience. "I need you to step back and allow us to manage this situation." Judge Washington stood unwavering, her briefcase resting at her side, her stance exuding the calm assurance of one who had navigated contentious courtrooms, confrontational lawyers, and formidable defendants without ever faltering in her poise. "Officer, I'm merely inquiring about the legal grounds for this detention," she responded, her tone steady yet laced with an undercurrent that should have alerted Sullivan to the fact that he was facing someone far more informed than he had presumed. The other officers, Torres, Jackson, and Martinez, started to feel an unmistakable change in the air. They had collaborated with Sullivan long enough to discern the ominous signals preceding his temper's eruption, yet they also observed an unsettling quality about this woman that stirred their unease. Her vocabulary, her posture, her utter fearlessness in the presence of 4 armed officers, everything about her hinted that she was not the person Sullivan had presumed her to be. Sullivan's expression grew somber. In his mind, this was a straightforward equation. He stood as a police captain, a figure molded by 2 decades of experience, while she, a civilian, challenged his authority right there on the street. Her identity as a black woman only intensified his frustration. In Sullivan's perspective, a natural order existed, compelling individuals to remain within their assigned roles. "Ma'am, I won't ask you again," Sullivan stated, advancing toward Judge Washington. "You must proceed immediately, or you'll soon find yourself in handcuffs." The court employees who had previously been detained observed this new confrontation with increasing concern. Their eyes fell upon Judge Washington, a figure of familiarity and authority. She held one of the highest positions among the judges in the building, yet they were too distant to intervene or alert the officers to their disastrous error. Judge Washington fixed his gaze on Sullivan's badge, taking note of the number, 2847. She took note of his name tag, D. Sullivan. She meticulously recorded the badge numbers of the other 3 officers in her mind. In the hallowed halls of federal court, every detail held significance, and Judge Washington possessed an unwavering memory for each one. "Captain Sullivan," she articulated with deliberate clarity, "I believe there may be some misunderstanding regarding jurisdiction in this matter. This is federal property, and these individuals seem to be federal employees." The mention of his name and rank should have served as Sullivan's initial warning. Civilians often lack the knowledge to decipher police insignia or recognize ranking officers, yet Sullivan was consumed by anger, oblivious to the subtle warnings around him. Unbeknownst to those present, this seemingly ordinary evening would unveil a long-concealed pattern, for Judge Washington was no ordinary federal judge. She held the unique position of being the sole judge in the district empowered to initiate immediate federal oversight of any law enforcement agency, and for years, she had been meticulously recording patterns of police misconduct. The events that followed would echo through news networks nationwide, dissected by legal analysts and examined in police training programs as a cautionary tale of how one fleeting lapse in judgment can unravel a lifetime of achievements. Sullivan stood mere feet away from Judge Washington, his face a vivid shade of anger, hands tightly balled at his sides. 2 decades of unchallenged power had ingrained in him the expectation of instant obedience whenever he elevated his tone. The woman's unwavering calmness and her relentless challenges were pushing him closer to a fury that promised to be devastating. "Lady, I'm not sure who you believe yourself to be," Sullivan growled, "but you're about to discover that when I issue an order, you obey it." "I don't care if you believe yourself to be some sort of lawyer," Captain Sullivan retorted. Judge Washington interjected, her voice maintaining its composure yet resonating with the undeniable authority of one who was well-versed in managing courtrooms brimming with contentious attorneys and perilous defendants. "I am Federal Judge Rebecca Washington of the Southern District of Georgia, and you are currently violating Federal Statute 18 U.S.C. 242, which prohibits the deprivation of constitutional rights under color of law." The words struck the other 3 officers with the force of a physical blow. Officer Torres indeed took a step back. Officer Jackson's hand instinctively drifted away from his weapon. Officer Martinez cast a wary glance around, acutely conscious of the federal courthouse security cameras that were surely capturing every nuance of this encounter. Yet Captain Sullivan, his vision shrouded in fury and bruised ego, perceived only a singular sound, a black woman asserting what he could and could not do. "I don't care if you're the Queen of England," Sullivan bellowed, saliva spraying from his mouth. "You're meddling in police affairs, and it's time you learn some respect." Judge Washington stood still, yet her mind operated with the accuracy of a finely tuned machine. She meticulously catalogued each breach of procedure, every constitutional infraction, and every federal statute that was being violated in real time. What weighed heavily on her mind was the undeniable reality that every moment unfolding was captured by numerous federal security systems, ensuring this evidence would endure for eternity. The change in the other officers was unmistakable. They had transformed from assured law enforcement professionals into individuals who abruptly understood they could be witnessing the twilight of their careers. Officer Torres, a mere 8 months into his tenure with the department, appeared as though he might lose his composure at any moment. "Captain," Torres murmured softly. "Perhaps we ought to." "Enough, Torres," Sullivan interrupted sharply. "This woman believes she can descend upon us and dictate the manner in which we perform our duties. She is on the brink of a revelation." Judge Washington could perceive the unfolding path of events that lay ahead. For decades, she had sat in courtrooms, observing as individuals made choices that would irrevocably alter the course of their lives. She had witnessed defendants admit to crimes they had not committed, attorneys undermine their own cases, and prosecutors exceed their bounds in ways that rendered years of investigation futile. Yet, she had never witnessed an individual poised to undertake such a profound act of professional self-destruction with such unwavering resolve. "Captain Sullivan," she implored, her voice laced with urgency as she sought to avert the impending disaster looming on the horizon. "I strongly advise you to contact your supervisor before this situation escalates further." To Sullivan, those words rang out as the definitive challenge to his command. In his warped reasoning, retreating at this juncture would signify a loss from which he could never truly bounce back. The remaining officers observed intently. In the backdrop loomed the federal courthouse. This woman was challenging not only his judgment but also his fundamental right to don the badge. He arrived at his conclusion. Sullivan advanced, seizing Judge Washington by her left arm and forcefully pushing her against his patrol car. The impact was sufficient to send her briefcase tumbling to the ground, scattering legal documents across the asphalt in a chaotic flurry. "You're under arrest for interfering with police business," he bellowed, his knee digging into her back as he fumbled for his handcuffs. The sound of Judge Washington's briefcase striking the ground reverberated through the parking lot, sharp and sudden, reminiscent of a gunshot. Federal case files drift through the humid air of Atlanta. In that instant, Captain Derek Sullivan stepped over a threshold that would unleash repercussions beyond his wildest comprehension. As the other officers comprehended the identity of Captain Sullivan's recent target, a pallor washed over their faces. Assaulting a federal judge transcends mere physical attack. It is a federal offense that inevitably brings the FBI into the fray, and there is no turning back. Officer Torres was the first to grasp the enormity of the events that had just unfolded. As Judge Washington's federal case files lay strewn across the parking lot, he caught sight of the official seals, the federal court headers, and the classified markings that signified these were not mere legal documents. "Captain," Torres murmured, his voice scarcely a breath, "Captain, I believe," but Sullivan had drifted too far into his own thoughts to hear. He had Judge Washington pinned against his patrol car, her hands restrained behind her back, utterly convinced that he was imparting a crucial lesson on the importance of respecting police authority. In his adrenaline-fueled state, he was oblivious to the terror in his officers' voices, nor did he notice the federal courthouse security guards swiftly approaching their position. Judge Washington, despite the chill of the cold metal pressing against her, maintained an air of unwavering composure. Her time on the federal bench had imparted a crucial lesson. Panic stands as the adversary of justice, while maintaining dignity in the face of pressure often serves as the mightiest weapon against tyranny. "Captain Sullivan," she said, her voice muffled yet unmistakably clear, "badge number 2847. The individual overseeing your work is Lieutenant Commander James Morrison, reachable at extension 4477. The federal statute you are presently contravening imposes a maximum sentence of 10 years in federal prison." The clarity of her understanding struck the other officers with the force of a lightning bolt. Civilians were unaware of badge numbers, the hierarchy of supervisory authority, or the intricacies of federal sentencing guidelines. Access to such intricate details of law enforcement procedures is reserved for those with a profound understanding of the field. Officer Jackson, with 15 years of experience under his belt, sensed a sinking feeling in his stomach as the fragments of the puzzle started to align. The briefcase brimming with federal documents, the impeccable legal terminology, the utter absence of fear in the presence of armed officers, the manner in which she held herself with unwavering authority, even while bound by physical restraints. "Oh, my God," Jackson murmured to Martinez. "She's truly a federal judge." Martinez, adhering to department protocol, had been capturing the interaction on his body camera when it dawned on him that he was documenting what could become the most disastrous law enforcement failure in Georgia's history. His hands trembled as the realization dawned on him that this footage would probably serve as crucial evidence in a federal criminal trial. Sullivan, his knee firmly pressed into Judge Washington's back, finally caught a sound that broke through the haze of his fury, the unmistakable roar of multiple vehicles racing toward them, their emergency lights flashing in a frantic display. The security personnel at the federal courthouse had been vigilant, observing the unfolding events from the very outset. The Federal Protective Service, tasked with safeguarding all federal buildings and personnel, had established protocols specifically designed for such scenarios. Upon the threat to a federal judge's safety, the established protocols sprang into action, initiated seamlessly and without the need for deliberation. In under a minute and a half, 3 black SUVs bearing federal plates converged upon the scene. Federal agents clad in tactical gear appeared, weapons at the ready, not aimed at anyone in particular, yet unmistakably signaling that the situation had escalated beyond the control of local law enforcement. Federal agents, declared Supervisory Special Agent Maria Santos from the U.S. Marshals Service, released the individual immediately and stepped away from the vehicle. Sullivan glanced up to find himself encircled by half a dozen federal agents, their imposing presence turning what he had assumed was a routine arrest into a dramatic tableau reminiscent of a cinematic spectacle. For the first time since this encounter commenced, uncertainty seeped into his awareness. "This woman was meddling with," Sullivan began. "Sir," Agent Santos interjected, her voice imbued with unwavering authority, "that woman is Federal Judge Rebecca Washington. You must withdraw your hands from her at once and take a step back." The name Federal Judge Rebecca Washington struck Sullivan with the force of a physical blow. The name resonated in his memory, a familiar echo from the past. That name was known to every law enforcement officer in Georgia. She was the arbiter who had dispatched corrupt officers to federal incarceration. She was the presiding judge who had directed the pivotal civil rights cases that transformed 3 distinct police departments. She held the authority to subject entire law enforcement agencies to federal scrutiny. Sullivan's hands recoiled from Judge Washington as though struck by a jolt of electricity. The handcuffs he had been grasping fell to the floor with a sharp clatter. In the blink of an eye, his complexion shifted from a deep crimson to a ghostly pallor, all within a mere 3 seconds. Judge Washington adjusted her jacket, gathered her disordered legal papers with Officer Torres's assistance, and turned to confront Sullivan, embodying the composed dignity of one who had just underscored a lesson on power, authority, and the repercussions of bias. The events that followed would set in motion an inquiry that would unveil corruption permeating the upper echelons of the department. What Captain Sullivan remained oblivious to was that the act of assaulting a federal judge carries consequences far beyond the mere termination of careers. It activates federal protocols that are unyielding, unmaskable, and impossible to overlook, and the evidence they were on the brink of uncovering would reveal that this was not his first encounter. In a mere 6 minutes following Agent Santos's identification of Judge Washington, a cascade of federal protocols sprang into action, engaging 4 distinct federal agencies, the U.S. The Attorney's Office, along with the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, mandates that the Federal Protective Service Protocol FPS 2847 necessitates immediate notification regarding any threats to federal judicial personnel, U.S. The Marshal Service Protocol USMS 1847 requires a comprehensive investigation into any physical assault directed at a federal judge. The FBI Protocol FBICR 2847 has initiated an automatic review of civil rights violations concerning any instances of force employed by local law enforcement against federal officials. Captain Sullivan remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the unraveling of his career before him. Judge Washington, now encircled by federal agents who accorded her the respect she deserved, initiated the journey that would ultimately culminate in his downfall. Agent Santos, Judge Washington stated, her voice regaining its customary judicial cadence, I require incident report number FBI 2847 ATL to be submitted within the hour. Captain Sullivan breached the provisions of 18 U.S.C. 242, 18 U.S.C. 245, and may have also contravened 42 U.S.C. 1983. I will also require the video evidence obtained from courthouse cameras 7, 12, and 15, which provide overlapping coverage of the entire incident. Sullivan observed in mounting dread as Judge Washington showcased the extent of her authority. She wasn't merely reciting the law, she was setting into motion a federal machinery that he had been completely unaware of. Each protocol she referenced would produce reports destined for the scrutiny of federal prosecutors. Each camera she mentioned would yield proof that could neither be concealed nor obliterated. Officer Torres made his way to his captain, a palpable hesitance shadowing his steps. Captain, we ought to reach out to Lieutenant Commander Morrison immediately, Sullivan said, his nod slow and heavy, as the weight of the situation settled in, revealing just how far beyond his grasp it truly was. Unbeknownst to him, Lieutenant Commander Morrison had already received communication, not from Sullivan's team, but from the Federal Protective Service, which operated under notification protocols that circumvented the local command structures entirely. Morrison's phone had been ringing for 3 long minutes when Sullivan finally decided to call. Morrison speaking. Lieutenant Commander, this is Captain Sullivan speaking. We find ourselves facing a predicament at the federal courthouse, Sullivan. Morrison interjected, his voice strained with a barely contained urgency. Please tell me you did not just assault Federal Judge Rebecca Washington. The silence from Sullivan spoke volumes, revealing everything Morrison needed to understand. Sullivan, may I inquire about your current whereabouts? I find myself at the courthouse, surrounded by federal agents when Morrison's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. Do not say another word over this radio channel. I am currently on my way with my legal advisor. Do not speak to anyone, do not make any statements, and do not leave the scene until I arrive. Yet, Morrison understood that the moment had slipped away, and it was already too late. The federal assault charges levied against police officers were not addressed by local prosecutors, who may have been open to negotiation. The U.S. took charge of their management. The Attorney's Office, a place where Judge Washington maintained personal connections with each prosecutor, and where Sullivan's 2 decades of service held no significance whatsoever. Judge Washington was now engaged in a hushed conversation with Agent Santos, recounting the intricate details of the incident that would lay the groundwork for federal charges. Her remarkable recall for intricate details was the stuff of legend among legal professionals. She had the remarkable ability to remember conversations word for word after they took place, and her reliability with federal prosecutors was beyond question. Agent Santos, it is important for you to understand that Captain Sullivan has exhibited a consistent pattern of behavior, indicating that this was not merely an isolated incident, Judge Washington remarked. His immediate assumption that I was merely another civilian in need of a lesson in respect reveals deep-seated issues with bias training within the department. Those phrases, bias and training issues, serve as federal code for an investigation that could subject entire police departments to federal oversight. Sullivan, positioned 20 feet away, could discern enough of the dialogue to grasp that Judge Washington was not merely pursuing charges against him as an individual. She was instigating an extensive evaluation of his whole department. Officer Martinez continued to capture every moment on his body camera, yet he now realized that this footage would serve a purpose beyond mere evidence in Sullivan's case. This could serve as crucial evidence in a federal pattern and practice investigation, potentially extending over several years and culminating in court-mandated reforms for the entire police force. The other officers, Torres, Jackson, and Martinez, were starting to grasp that their own careers could be at risk merely for having been witnesses to this disastrous event. Federal investigators would conduct separate interviews with them, meticulously examine their individual records, and ascertain whether they had facilitated or engaged in Sullivan's pattern of misconduct. Yet, what they failed to comprehend was that every moment was being meticulously documented not solely by the vigilant courthouse security, but also by federal surveillance systems that meticulously capture each interaction on federal property, with recordings that are impervious to deletion or suppression. Lieutenant Commander James Morrison made his way to the federal courthouse alongside the department's legal counsel, Attorney David Richardson, anticipating the handling of what he believed would be a fairly standard excessive force complaint. What they discovered instead was a federal crime scene, where evidence technicians meticulously captured images of skid marks on the pavement, while agents gathered the scattered legal documents of Judge Washington as crucial evidence. Morrison had been acquainted with Sullivan for a span of 15 years. They had ascended through the ranks side by side, shielding one another during internal affairs inquiries, and cultivated a mutual comprehension of how to navigate troublesome grievances from the community. Yet, as Morrison observed Sullivan beside his patrol car, federal agents meticulously recording every detail of the scene, he understood that their protective network was on the brink of an unprecedented trial. Captain Sullivan, Morrison stated with caution, fully aware that federal agents were capturing every syllable, you are hereby relieved of duty pending investigation. From this moment onward, all communications will be managed by Richardson. Attorney Richardson found himself perspiring, even in the coolness of the evening air. His expertise lay in the realm of defending against police misconduct, yet his background was solely rooted in dealings with local prosecutors who could potentially be open to negotiation. Federal charges existed in an entirely distinct realm, a realm where political motivations and professional ties held no sway, and where the evidence either substantiated the charges or it did not. Your Honor, Richardson stepped forward, a palpable hesitation in his demeanor. I'm David Richardson, here on behalf of Captain Sullivan. I was hoping we could have a conversation about Mr. Richardson, but Judge Washington interjected. This has now escalated into a matter of federal criminal concern. All communications must be directed through the U.S. Attorney's Office. Richardson's face drained of color. A federal criminal issue signified an FBI inquiry, a federal grand jury, and the looming possibility of federal incarceration. This indicated that Sullivan's case would fall under the jurisdiction of federal prosecutors, experts in civil rights violations, who regarded police misconduct as a critical focus for legal action. Agent Santos was now in collaboration with FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, who had recently arrived from the Atlanta field office accompanied by a mobile forensic unit. The involvement of the FBI signified that this case would harness the complete arsenal of federal law enforcement, a force capable of revealing patterns of misconduct that stretch back for decades. Agent Walsh, Judge Washington stated, I trust you'll find it necessary to examine Captain Sullivan's complete disciplinary record as you conduct your investigation. Given his conduct this evening, I have a strong inclination that you will uncover a series of constitutional breaches that his department has neglected to rectify. Agent Walsh acknowledged with a nod, jotting down notes that would initiate subpoenas for Sullivan's personnel file, internal affairs documentation, and every grievance lodged against him throughout his two-decade tenure. Federal investigators possessed records that local oversight agencies frequently overlooked or concealed. Sullivan observed the unfolding dialogue, a sense of mounting despair tightening around him. He watched as the very fabric of his existence was methodically unraveled by federal agents wielding resources and authority far beyond what local investigators could ever hope to contend with. Every grievance he believed had been concealed, every observer who had been coerced into quietude, every fragment of proof that had vanished, all of it would be scrutinized by federal agents who remained untouched by the sway of local politics. Morrison was now in collaboration with Chief of Police Robert Hayes, who had been roused from his slumber at home to learn that one of his captains had attacked a federal judge. Hayes grasped instantly that this event would invoke federal scrutiny over his entire department, scrutiny that could lead to court-mandated reforms, federal oversight, and budget limitations that might endure for years. "Morrison," Hayes said over the phone, "I require a comprehensive timeline of every complaint lodged against Sullivan for the past 5 years. It is essential that I receive it by morning, and it must be thorough in its coverage. The FBI is bound to make the request, and I wish to uncover what they will discover before it comes to light." "Certainly, sir." Yet, Morrison understood that assembling Sullivan's full record would resemble chronicling a series of transgressions that the department had deliberately overlooked. Every complaint that had been brushed aside, every witness interview that had been cursory, every internal investigation that had taken place, every report that had been filed, ended with a verdict of insufficient evidence. All of it would now be scrutinized by federal agents who grasped precisely how local departments shielded troublesome officers. Judge Washington was finalizing her statement to Agent Walsh, outlining the details that would serve as the basis for federal charges. Her account was meticulous, thorough, and harrowing, precisely what federal prosecutors required to construct an unassailable case. "Agent Walsh," Judge Washington concluded, "I want to emphasize that Captain Sullivan's actions tonight were not the result of poor judgment or inadequate training. Their existence stemmed from entrenched bias and a conviction that his power eclipsed federal law. Such a mindset does not flourish in solitude. It flourishes in the very departments designed to support and safeguard it." The officials believed they could manage the situation, unaware of the profound depths of the corruption. Judge Washington had been meticulously recording instances of police misconduct for years, biding her time for the perfect opportunity to intervene. By 11:30 p.m., just under 3 hours after Sullivan had initially seized Judge Washington's arm, federal prosecutors at the U.S. The attorney's office was in the midst of examining preliminary evidence and gearing up to file federal charges within the next 48 hours. Michael Torres, an assistant U.S. attorney, served as the Civil Rights Division's expert on cases involving police misconduct, and he bears no relation to Officer Torres. Throughout his 12-year career, he achieved the notable feat of prosecuting 47 law enforcement officers for violations of federal civil rights. As the clock struck 11:15 p.m., his phone began to ring. Upon hearing the news of a police captain's assault on federal judge Rebecca Washington, Torres realized he was stepping into the most high-profile case of his career. "Judge Washington," Torres said when he called her at home, "I've reviewed the preliminary FBI report. We will be initiating federal charges pursuant to 18 U.S.C. 242 and 18 U.S.C. 245. In light of your position as a federal judge and the evident bias that has emerged, we will be advocating for the maximum penalty range." The statute in question, 18 U.S.C. 242, serves as the federal civil rights law that forbids the infringement of constitutional rights under the guise of legal authority. The federal hate crime statute, 18 U.S.C. 245, imposed heightened penalties for offenses committed against victims based on their race. The cumulative nature of these charges held the potential for a maximum sentence of 15 years in federal prison. Judge Washington recognized the importance of Torres' call. Federal prosecutors refrained from summoning victims to deliberate on charging decisions unless they possessed unwavering confidence in their capacity to achieve convictions. Torres reached out to convey to Judge Washington that Sullivan would encounter the full force of federal justice. At the same time, within the walls of FBI headquarters in Atlanta, Special Agent Walsh was meticulously assembling the extensive 20-year dossier of complaints, lawsuits, and disciplinary actions against Sullivan. What she uncovered was a pattern of misconduct so extensive that it indicated a fundamental breakdown in the oversight systems of the police department. 43 allegations of undue force. 27 claims of racial discrimination. The city has resolved 15 lawsuits through confidential agreements. 7 internal affairs investigations reached their conclusions, citing insufficient evidence, even in the face of compelling witness testimony. A troubling pattern of behavior that ought to have led to termination long ago, yet was instead fostered and shielded by supervisors who prioritized loyalty above accountability. The report from Agent Walsh would set in motion a federal pattern and practice investigation under 42 U.S.C. 14141, subjecting the entire police department to federal oversight and necessitating extensive reforms that would require millions of dollars and years to execute. Sullivan found himself at home in his suburban ranch house, gazing at his police academy graduation photo, grappling with the realization that 2 decades of what he deemed successful law enforcement had culminated in this very moment. In the dim light of their bedroom, Linda sat weeping softly, fully aware that their once stable middle-class existence, the college funds for their children, and the dreams of a secure retirement had all been shattered by a single act of racist hubris. Sullivan's phone had been incessantly ringing ever since news of the incident rippled through the department. Colleagues, supervisors, and union representatives were all eager to uncover the details of the incident and assess the extent of the damage. Yet, Sullivan found himself at a loss, unable to articulate how he had mistaken a federal judge for an ordinary citizen. He struggled to justify his use of force against an individual who posed no threat and could not fathom why he had overlooked the myriad warning signs that should have urged him to cease his actions. Sarah Martinez, the attorney for the police union, had examined the preliminary evidence and conveyed news that crushed Sullivan's final glimmer of hope. "Derek, this is not a case we can mount a defense for. The evidence is irrefutable, the victim is a federal judge, and the FBI possesses video documentation of the entire incident. It would be wise to seek a negotiation for the least possible sentence, while holding on to the hope that the federal prosecutors might exhibit some leniency." However, federal prosecutors seldom exhibited leniency when law enforcement officials infringed upon the civil rights of federal judges. The U.S. Attorney's Office was keenly aware of its reputation, and taking on corrupt police officers resonated well with both voters and civil rights advocates. Chief Hayes found himself in a crucial meeting with the mayor, the city attorney, and federal mediators, engaging in discussions about the impending terms of federal oversight that would soon be imposed on the department. The situation involving Judge Washington had intensified long-standing investigations, and the city was on the brink of federal intervention that would transform every facet of police operations. "Chief," Mayor Patricia Johnson said, her voice taut with restrained fury, "I need to know how many more Derek Sullivans we have in this department, and I need to know how we're going to prevent this from happening again." Hayes understood that the answer would be nothing short of catastrophic. The department was home to numerous officers whose complaint patterns mirrored those of Sullivan, and averting future incidents would necessitate profound systemic changes that the department had long resisted. The revelations from the federal investigation would send shockwaves throughout the nation. Captain Sullivan's 2-decade journey in law enforcement was not forged through exemplary police work. It was constructed upon a foundation of fear, secrecy, and a system that shielded him at every opportunity. After 18 relentless hours of investigation, federal agents stumbled upon evidence that elevated Sullivan's case from a mere instance of misconduct to a sprawling federal conspiracy inquiry, implicating numerous officers and supervisors. As FBI agent Walsh delved into Sullivan's personnel file, a disturbing pattern emerged, sending a chill through her gut. Each and every complaint lodged against Sullivan had undergone scrutiny by the same internal affairs detective, Lt. Michael Foster. Each and every inquiry had reached a conclusion marked by a lack of sufficient evidence. Each and every witness had inexplicably turned unavailable or questionable throughout the course of the investigation. For 15 years, Foster had been the steadfast guardian of Sullivan, their unspoken agreement yielding millions in legal settlements that the city willingly dispersed to evade the watchful eye of federal scrutiny. Walsh's revelation indicated that Foster would additionally confront federal charges for conspiring to infringe upon civil rights as outlined in 18 U.S.C. 241. The evidence was irrefutable. Email records indicated that Foster had guided Sullivan in crafting incident reports designed to endure examination. Phone records unveiled a connection between Foster and Sullivan prior to the internal affairs interviews. Financial records revealed that Sullivan had assisted Foster in securing a promotion by offering misleading testimony during another officer's disciplinary hearing. In the stillness of the early morning, at precisely 2:30 a.m., federal agents took Lieutenant Foster into custody at his residence in Marietta, Georgia. The arrest warrant stemmed from evidence indicating that Foster had methodically stifled inquiries into Sullivan's misconduct for more than 10 years. The arrest of Foster signified that additional officers involved in the web of deceit would likewise confront federal charges. Judge Washington had been keeping a close eye on the investigation's progress, receiving regular updates from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Every fresh insight reinforced her belief that Sullivan's actions were emblematic of a systemic breakdown, rather than mere personal wrongdoing. During their morning phone call, Judge Washington conveyed to Assistant U.S. Attorney Torres, "I want to ensure that this investigation addresses the systemic issues that enabled Captain Sullivan's behavior for 20 years. While individual prosecution holds significance, the necessity for institutional reform cannot be overlooked." Torres recognized that Judge Washington was framing this case as a pivotal moment for sweeping police reform. Her sway with federal oversight agencies would guarantee that Sullivan's prosecution resulted in enduring transformations in police accountability across Georgia. By morning, the local news media had seized upon the story, yet they utterly misinterpreted its true significance. Local reporters concentrated on Sullivan's arrest and the assault charges, overlooking the broader narrative of a federal investigation into systemic police corruption. Yet, the national news organizations grasped the unfolding situation with clarity. CNN's justice correspondent noted that the Sullivan case is poised to initiate the most thorough federal investigation into police misconduct in Georgia since the 1960s. Meanwhile, a civil rights reporter from the Washington Post characterized it as a quintessential illustration of how singular events can reveal systemic shortcomings. Sullivan stirred from slumber in his suburban sanctuary, only to find that his name had surged to prominence on Twitter, his image flickering across national screens, and civil rights advocates were wielding his story as a poignant illustration of the deep-seated issues plaguing American law enforcement. Angela Davis, the esteemed advocate for civil rights, delivered a statement that resonated with profound national importance. Captain Sullivan's attack on Judge Washington embodies the clash between America's enduring legacy of racial oppression and the constitutional principles that safeguard our democracy. When law enforcement officers feel emboldened to assault federal judges without fear of consequence, the very foundation of our justice system is jeopardized. Sullivan's defense attorney, David Richardson, found himself grappling with the challenge of uncovering a viable defense strategy. Defending federal civil rights cases proved to be a formidable challenge, as they centered on unmistakable constitutional violations rather than intricate legal nuances. The case against Sullivan was meticulously recorded on numerous cameras, observed by federal agents, and chronicled by one of the most esteemed judges in the federal system. Derek, Richardson stated during their morning meeting, "The federal prosecutors are extending a plea agreement, 7 years in federal prison in exchange for cooperation in the investigation of Lt. Foster and the other officers. It's the best deal you're going to get." Sullivan fixed his gaze on the plea agreement, a document poised to dismantle the very foundation he had painstakingly constructed over 2 decades. 7 years behind bars in a federal prison resulted in the forfeiture of his pension, the loss of benefits, and the extinguishing of any prospects for future employment in law enforcement. However, contesting the charges entailed the peril of facing the full brunt of a 15-year sentence, and Richardson had unequivocally indicated that achieving victory at trial was nearly unattainable. The inquiry was broadening its scope, reaching beyond Sullivan and Foster to encompass additional officers involved in the web of concealment. Federal agents meticulously examined each case Sullivan had handled, every arrest he had executed, and all the incident reports he had documented. Numerous cases were being reversed as revelations of Sullivan's ongoing misconduct emerged. Yet, the repercussions had merely commenced. When the FBI delves into instances of police misconduct, their scrutiny extends beyond a single officer. They assess the entire framework that permitted such behavior to persist unchallenged for 20 years. What they uncovered would lay bare the corruption that permeated the upper echelons of city government. 6 weeks following the assault, the U.S. Attorney's Office unveiled a sweeping federal indictment that astonished even the most seasoned civil rights attorneys with its breadth and intricacy. The case of United States v. Derek Sullivan, Michael Foster, and James Morrison encompassed allegations under 4 distinct federal statutes: conspiracy to violate civil rights, as outlined in 18 U.S.C. 241, deprivation of rights under color of law, specified in 18 U.S.C. 242, violations pertaining to hate crimes, detailed in 18 U.S.C. 245, and racketeering conspiracy, as described in 18 U.S.C. 1962. The The racketeering charges stemmed from evidence indicating that Sullivan, Foster, and Morrison had orchestrated a coordinated effort to shield one another from accountability, all the while methodically infringing upon the constitutional rights of citizens. Federal prosecutors meticulously recorded more than 200 instances in which the three men concealed misconduct, fabricated reports, and intimidated witnesses. Judge Washington was present at the arraignment hearing, seated in the public gallery, as Sullivan, Foster, and Morrison faced formal charges of federal crimes. The courtroom brimmed with journalists, civil rights advocates, and federal prosecutors, all acutely aware that they were partaking in a pivotal moment for police accountability. Federal Judge Thomas Bradley, overseeing the arraignment, established bond conditions that promptly terminated the law enforcement careers of all three men. Sullivan had to relinquish his badge, his weapon, and his law enforcement certification. He was barred from any communication with both current and former police officers who could potentially serve as witnesses in the case. Mr. Sullivan, Judge Bradley declared from the bench, the allegations in this indictment reveal a pattern of behavior that undermines the very foundation of our constitutional system. The court views you as a considerable flight risk and a threat to the community. Sullivan's bond has been established at $500,000, backed by his property, and necessitating GPS monitoring. The circumstances dictated that he would endure the months leading up to the trial confined to his home, observing as his erstwhile associates took the stand to testify against him in pursuit of leniency in their sentences. The psychological toll on Sullivan was profound. 2 decades of conviction in his invincibility had crumbled in an instant, brought down by a single encounter with an individual wielding genuine power. Days passed in confinement, where he immersed himself in the news surrounding his case, observed as former allies withdrew their support, and came to the unsettling realization that his very identity as a law enforcement officer was constructed upon a foundation of the very legal transgressions he was meant to uphold. Within a mere fortnight of the arraignment, Linda Sullivan took the decisive step of filing for divorce. Their offspring adopted new surnames to distance themselves from their father's misdeeds. Sullivan's police pension hung in suspension, awaiting the resolution of federal charges, casting him into a state of financial reliance on relatives who grew ever more hesitant to extend their support. Judge Washington, in the meantime, was collaborating with federal oversight agencies to enact sweeping reforms within the police department. Her recommendations would serve as the blueprint for federal intervention in law enforcement agencies across the nation. The Sullivan case stands as a pivotal moment for redefining police accountability, Judge Washington remarked to the federal monitor tasked with overseeing the necessary departmental reforms. We must ensure that this type of systematic misconduct never again receives institutional protection. The reforms advocated by Judge Washington were groundbreaking: mandatory body cameras for all officers, independent oversight of excessive force complaints, federal review of all use of force incidents, and automatic termination for officers with patterns of misconduct. The implementation of these changes would entail a financial burden of millions for the city, yet they hold the promise of safeguarding against future individuals like Derek Sullivan from acting without consequence. Federal prosecutors were actively seeking civil asset forfeiture of Sullivan's property, contending that his house and savings were acquired through the proceeds of his corrupt law enforcement career. The forfeiture action signified that, regardless of whether Sullivan managed to evade prison, he would forfeit all that he had amassed over 2 decades. The national civil rights community observed Sullivan's case closely, viewing it as a litmus test for the federal government's dedication to ensuring police accountability. Organizations such as the NAACP, the American Civil Liberties Union, and the Southern Poverty Law Center submitted amicus briefs advocating for maximum sentences and extensive reforms. Reverend Al Sharpton delivered a statement that encapsulated the wider implications. Derek Sullivan believed he could confront a federal judge, emboldened by 2 decades of unchallenged aggression towards ordinary citizens. The only path to dismantling the enduring cycle of police impunity that has shielded officers such as Sullivan for generations is through federal prosecution. Yet, the repercussions had merely commenced. The loss of his job was merely the beginning. Captain Sullivan stood on the precipice of federal criminal charges, each one looming with the weight of a decade behind bars. Judge Washington, with a calculated resolve, prepared to make a decisive move that would guarantee he could never inflict harm upon another soul again. The federal pattern and practice investigation, initiated by Sullivan's assault, revealed a level of corruption so pervasive that the Department of Justice deemed it necessary to place the entire police force under federal oversight, an extraordinary measure that had only occurred 3 times before in U.S. history. Dr. Sarah Chen, a federal monitor and former prosecutor with a focus on police reform, has been appointed to guide sweeping changes aimed at transforming every facet of law enforcement operations. Her directive encompassed a thorough reorganization of internal operations, the establishment of community oversight frameworks, and a federal examination of every hiring and promotion choice. At her inaugural public meeting, Dr. Chen disclosed that the findings from the Sullivan investigation expose a profound institutional failure across all levels. This department has consistently shielded officers who have infringed upon the constitutional rights of citizens, while simultaneously punishing those officers who dared to expose such misconduct. The expense associated with federal oversight was astonishing. The city found itself obligated to cover the costs for Dr. Chen's team of federal monitors, introduce new training initiatives for every officer, enhance technology systems to guarantee accountability, and resolve numerous civil rights lawsuits that emerged as the extent of departmental corruption came to light. Mayor Patricia Johnson confronted a budget crisis that jeopardized city services, as millions of dollars were diverted to meet federal oversight mandates. The repercussions in the political arena were immediate. Voters, seeking accountability, recalled 3 city council members who had backed the police department's opposition to reform. Judge Washington received an appointment to the Federal Advisory Committee on Police Reform, a role that bestowed upon her significant national influence regarding policies of accountability within law enforcement. Her involvement in the Sullivan case positioned her as a foremost authority on the potential of federal oversight to reform corrupt police departments. The Sullivan case demonstrates that individual prosecution must be paired with institutional reform, Judge Washington asserted before Congress. We cannot merely apprehend corrupt officers. It is imperative that we dismantle the systems that shield and perpetuate their corruption. Her testimony before Congress catalyzed the Federal Police Accountability Act, a pivotal piece of legislation mandating that all law enforcement agencies receiving federal funding establish oversight mechanisms akin to those created in the wake of Sullivan's transgressions. Sullivan's former colleagues were collaborating with federal investigators in return for lighter sentences, offering evidence of corruption that extended to the upper echelons of city government. The inquiry broadened to encompass city council members who had obstructed police reform, prosecutors who had declined to bring charges against problematic officers, and judges who had dismissed cases due to prosecutorial influence rather than substantiated evidence. Officer Torres, the novice who had observed Sullivan's attack on Judge Washington, emerged as a federal whistleblower, his testimony instrumental in securing the conviction of 17 more officers for civil rights violations. His cooperation agreement encompassed federal witness protection and relocation assistance, acknowledging that his decision to testify against corrupt colleagues had rendered him a target for retaliation. Torres fulfilled the oath every police officer takes, Judge Washington remarked during the commendation ceremony. He opted to uphold the Constitution instead of succumbing to the allure of corruption. The police union, which had once rallied behind Sullivan, found itself compelled to adopt new policies that barred the defense of officers facing federal civil rights charges. Reformers took the helm of union leadership, pledging their dedication to accountability over impunity. The influence of federal oversight was yielding tangible outcomes. Complaints regarding excessive force saw a remarkable decline of 67%, while citizen satisfaction with police services surged by 45%. Additionally, federal prosecutors noted a significant decrease in civil rights violations committed by law enforcement officers. Yet, the toll on humanity from Sullivan's transgressions kept rising. Families victimized by Sullivan throughout his 2-decade career were pursuing civil rights lawsuits, aiming for millions in damages. Every lawsuit unveiled further proof of the pervasive breakdown that had allowed Sullivan's actions to persist. Maria Rodriguez, whose son had suffered at the hands of Sullivan 3 years prior, took the stand at federal hearings to share the enduring effects of police misconduct. My son continues to be haunted by nightmares of what Officer Sullivan inflicted upon him. Yet, the knowledge that Sullivan will never inflict pain on another family brings us a measure of solace. The journey of transformation was fraught with challenges. Law enforcement officials, accustomed to the privileges of the previous system of impunity, rallied in protest against federal oversight, asserting that the introduction of accountability measures rendered their duties unfeasible. Yet, the backing from the community for reform was undeniable, leading to the ousting of political leaders who resisted federal oversight. The transformations were nothing short of groundbreaking, yet Captain Sullivan's personal confrontation loomed on the horizon, for Judge Washington had one last maneuver that would guarantee he could inflict harm no more. On a frigid February morning, 8 months after his attack on Judge Washington, Derek Sullivan faced federal Judge Thomas Bradley, awaiting a sentence poised to shatter the remnants of his existence. The federal courthouse brimmed with civil rights activists, survivors of Sullivan's abuse, and journalists chronicling what had evolved into the most pivotal police accountability case in Georgia's history. Judge Washington occupied the front row, a palpable embodiment of the dignity and authority that Sullivan had sought to undermine. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Torres unveiled evidence that depicted Sullivan as the linchpin of a corrupt network, one that had preyed upon hundreds of citizens for 2 decades. The sentencing memorandum presented victim impact statements from 47 individuals who had suffered brutality, false arrests, or intimidation at the hands of Sullivan and his associates. Your Honor, Torres stated, Derek Sullivan wielded his badge and gun to instill fear in citizens who were powerless to resist. He was convinced that his uniform rendered him invulnerable, that his authority eclipsed the Constitution, and that his victims were utterly powerless to seek accountability. He was mistaken on every front. Sullivan's defense attorney delivered a final, urgent appeal for mercy, contending that Sullivan was shaped by systemic issues rather than personal malevolence. However, federal Judge Bradley had examined 2 decades of evidence revealing that Sullivan was the mastermind behind the corruption, rather than its victim. Mr. Sullivan, Judge Bradley intoned, his voice resonating with the gravitas of federal authority, you stand convicted of offenses that undermine the very bedrock of our democratic system. Officers who infringe upon the constitutional rights of citizens cannot be considered true law enforcement. They are lawbreakers cloaked in authority. The words struck with a chilling finality. 12 years confined within the walls of a federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release, the forfeiture of all assets acquired through nefarious means, and an enduring ban from any role within law enforcement. Sullivan would spend his days in federal institutions tailored for those who had succumbed to corruption, surrounded by fellow inmates, police officers, politicians, and public servants who had all forsaken their sacred oaths. Judge Washington observed Sullivan's sentencing with the contentment of one who had witnessed the fulfillment of justice through the rightful channels of the law. Yet her attention was swiftly turning towards the fundamental transformations necessary to ensure that future Derek Sullivans could no longer act without consequence. This sentence sends a clear message, Judge Washington remarked to reporters following the hearing. No individual stands above the law, neither police officers nor public officials, and certainly not those who wield their authority to infringe upon the rights they pledged to safeguard. Sullivan's personal ruin was total. His wife had left him, taking their children to another state. His residence had been taken through federal forfeiture proceedings. His police pension was no more. His certification in law enforcement had been irrevocably rescinded. Friends and family members had withdrawn from him, seeking to evade any connection to his misdeeds. The weight of the moment was palpable as Sullivan was escorted away in chains. The man who had devoted 2 decades to the illusion of invincibility now confronted the stark reality of 12 years in federal prison, a place where his identity as a corrupt police officer would render him vulnerable to the wrath of inmates who had suffered at the hands of law enforcement. Lieutenant Foster was sentenced to a decade in federal prison for his involvement in concealing Sullivan's offenses. Lieutenant Commander Morrison was sentenced to 8 years for his involvement in the conspiracy. 17 additional officers were handed down sentences that varied from probation to a maximum of 5 years in prison for their involvement in the corruption network. The federal investigation culminated in the prosecution of 23 law enforcement officers, marking the largest police corruption case in the history of Georgia. The city's financial burden surpassed $50 million, encompassing federal oversight expenses, civil rights settlements, and the implementation of reforms. Judge Washington's pivotal role in unveiling this corruption garnered her national acclaim as a staunch advocate for police accountability. She was honored with the Civil Rights Award from the NAACP, recognized with the Justice Award from the American Civil Liberties Union, and graced the cover of Time magazine as one of the most influential figures in the battle against government corruption. For Judge Washington, the true triumph lay not in the accolades or the applause. It was the understanding that comprehensive reforms would shield future victims from enduring the same harrowing experience she had faced in that courthouse parking lot. The federal oversight of the police department will persist for 5 years, guaranteeing that the reforms are lasting rather than fleeting. New officers underwent training in constitutional law and civil rights. Supervisors bore the responsibility for the actions of their subordinates. The presence of community oversight ensured a layer of external accountability, effectively thwarting the resurgence of corrupt practices. Yet, the most profound moment was still on the horizon, as Judge Washington's reaction to this assault would ignite a wave of federal legislation, forever altering the landscape of police accountability. 1 year after the assault on Derek Sullivan had ignited the most significant police reform in Georgia's history, Judge Washington found himself before the United States Senate Judiciary Committee, ready to testify about legislation poised to reshape police accountability across the nation. The Federal Police Accountability Act, a direct response to the Sullivan case, mandates that all law enforcement agencies benefiting from federal funding establish oversight mechanisms, enforce body camera protocols, and adopt independent investigation procedures for complaints regarding excessive force. The legislation marked a pivotal moment, embodying the most extensive police reform ever witnessed in American history. Senators, Judge Washington testified that Derek Sullivan's attack on my dignity constituted an affront to the very constitutional principles that uphold our democracy. Yet, his transgression transformed into a chance to showcase that our justice system, when executed with integrity, can bring even the mightiest to account and safeguard those who are most defenseless. The committee room lay in hushed anticipation as Judge Washington unveiled the intricate web of corruption that had shielded Sullivan for 2 decades, and the federal intervention that had ultimately restored justice. Her testimony unfolded on national television, captivating millions of Americans who recognized they were partaking in a pivotal moment in the struggle for civil rights. Senator Elizabeth Warren posed a question that resonated with the weight of national importance. Judge Washington, what would have transpired if you had been an ordinary citizen instead of a federal judge when Captain Sullivan assaulted you? Judge Washington's response was strikingly profound in its straightforwardness. Senator, for 2 decades, Derek Sullivan has perpetrated assaults on everyday citizens, evading any repercussions for his actions. The sole distinction lay in my capacity to initiate federal intervention and the insight to guarantee its efficacy. That dialogue emerged as the pivotal moment of the hearings, sharpening public awareness that true police accountability necessitated external oversight rather than mere internal inquiry. The Senate approved the Federal Police Accountability Act with a decisive vote of 78 to 22, showcasing a rare moment of bipartisan agreement on the urgent call for reform. 6 months later, President Biden enacted the legislation, with Judge Washington by his side as he wielded multiple pens, ensuring that fragments of this historic signing could be shared with civil rights organizations nationwide. At the signing ceremony, President Biden emphasized that this law guarantees that the injustices faced by Judge Washington and the actions of Derek Sullivan against countless victims over 2 decades will never again be shielded by institutional protection. The Sullivan case emerged as a blueprint for federal involvement in tainted law enforcement bodies. The Department of Justice leveraged the established precedent to subject 12 more police departments to federal oversight, implementing the same sweeping reforms that had revolutionized Sullivan's department. Derek Sullivan found himself navigating the confines of the Federal Correctional Institution in Coleman, Florida, a medium-security establishment notorious for harboring corrupt government officials as inmates. Prison records revealed that he had endured 2 assaults at the hands of inmates, individuals who had themselves suffered at the hands of law enforcement. This underscores the perilous reality confronting officers who find themselves incarcerated at the federal level. Every court had turned down his appeals, even the Supreme Court, which chose not to consider his case. Legal experts observed that Sullivan's conviction was remarkably straightforward, with evidence so compelling that no appellate court dared to challenge the federal prosecutor's management of the case. Judge Washington persisted in her efforts toward police reform through her role on the Federal Advisory Committee, aiding in the establishment of accountability measures designed to thwart future Derek Sullivans from acting without consequence. Her suggestions were being put into practice within law enforcement agencies nationwide. The financial settlements with Sullivan's victims amounted to more than $30 million, dispersed by the city via insurance policies that had escalated to exorbitant costs due to the pervasive misconduct. The insurance crisis necessitated further reforms, as companies were unwilling to provide coverage for law enforcement agencies lacking comprehensive accountability measures. Maria Rodriguez, mother of a son who had suffered at the hands of Sullivan, addressed the gathering at the signing ceremony for the Federal Police Accountability Act. Judge Washington demonstrated that dignity and courage possessed the power to triumph over hatred and corruption. Thanks to her strength, my son will navigate a world where police officers understand the weight of accountability for their actions. The change was evident in crime statistics, community relations, and the conduct of officers. The police department that once safeguarded Derek Sullivan had transformed into a national exemplar of constitutional law enforcement, boasting community trust ratings that soared above all others in the region. Judge Washington's concluding remarks at the Senate hearing encapsulated the enduring importance of her interaction with Derek Sullivan. What started as a single individual's racially charged attack has evolved into a powerful force for constitutional change. Our justice system, when applied correctly, has demonstrated its ability to safeguard the vulnerable, demand accountability from the powerful, and uphold the Constitution, ensuring that those who don the badge and uniform are not corrupted by their roles. Thus unfolded the tale of how a single act of racist aggression directed at a federal judge unraveled a two-decade career, laid bare systemic corruption, ignited sweeping reform, and demonstrated unequivocally that in America, no individual, without exception, stands above the law. Derek Sullivan believed he could strike Judge Washington without consequence. Instead, he discovered that certain individuals wield a power he had never envisioned, and to disrespect them would bring repercussions that would shadow him for the entirety of his existence. Gratitude to all who expressed respect, justice, and inspired in the comments. Your participation underscores the significance of narratives centered on dignity and accountability. If this narrative resonated with you, consider subscribing for more extraordinary accounts of bravery overcoming deceit. Until we meet again, keep in mind that no one stands above the law, and at times, the strongest weapon against injustice is the unwavering resolve to stand firm.